be talking about the different ways in which economics may be political. I also have a sign-up sheet here for those of you who haven't signed up to the email list but would like to. So please welcome Jack.
All right, thanks. Thanks for coming. I don't know if anyone can see this, but it's mainly for me, so don't worry if you can't. Yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks Ida and Isabel and others and Jostein before for doing other lectures and for organising this lecture series. It's been really fun. This lecture's, I think, a little bit different from some of the other ones that's gone so far. Rather than thinking about some of the different aspects and learning about some of the different aspects of economics that neoclassical economics leaves off the syllabus, I'm going to start thinking about economics in general as a discipline and a little bit of the history of it. The question, is economics political, is obviously massively polemical and massive, so I don't hope to really answer that properly in 40 minutes. The only goal really is to tease out some of the different ways in which you might want to answer this question, and in doing so that might slightly undermine the automatic reaction that economics is not political and has no political elements. To do that, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to first talk about the ways in which economics is kind of obviously political, the ways in which economists would admit that economics is political, the relationships economics has externally to politics, so the ways in which it affects politics and the ways and the kind of questions it asks and the way some of the questions it asks are political. But that's not, I don't think that's the most interesting way of answering this question. I think that we should think about whether we can say more, whether there's something about the history of economics or internally to economics itself, or the output of economics that in itself is politicized. So to do that, I'm going to briefly explore two angles. There's so many different ways we could go at this. There's a whole other area of kind of positive normative distinctions where we can think about whether there's something inherent about the nature of the subject matter of economics that should be political, but that's not really what I'm going to go into. What I'm going to talk about is two brief things. I'm going to start with a couple of brief historical episodes that highlight some of the ways in which politics has affected economics, so the ways in which economics as we know it now has been formed by political considerations in the past. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about, very short bit about some of the internal politics of economics. There's again lots that we could say on both these points, especially the latter point. And I'm really only going to take one small example. The whole point is just to give a kind of couple of little case studies, little episodes that might get you thinking about different ways in which economics and politics relate. So I'm not really going to answer the question in full. I'm just going to sketch out what kind of things you might want to be thinking about when answering this question. At the end, if I have time, apart from summarizing the relationships that I see at first between economics and politics, I'm also going to think about the one question, briefly say something about the one question that I think scares economists and any academics the most about saying what some questions like this might mean. What about the objectivity of the practicing academics? So what about the objectivity of economists? I'm going to try and see if I can say something a little bit about that if I have time at the end. If not, I'll just answer the question and you guys can answer it yourself. Cool. So I'm going to start with the ways in which economics is obviously political, the ways in which it seems trivial, the ways in which economists would accept that economics has a relationship to politics. And these are some of the ways which Ha-Jun Chang in a course to first-year economists this year has highlighted as well. The first is quite clear. Economics deals with very political topics. There's loads of examples of this, policy and international political issues. So like some of the issues that Isabel drawed on last week, stuff about global production, global trade, domestic issues as well, costing, different domestic policies. That's often falls into economic topics. Then lots of social questions that are also considered political. So there's lots of questions that economics often seeks to answer, maybe about distribution, sometimes about efficiency. Migration, efficiency, loads of things. It's too many examples to think of. Yeah, exactly. Migration. There's loads of things. In fact, sometimes, admittedly, economics fails to answer some of these questions, but really they are part of the remit of what economics and economic issues. Then lastly, often not thought of as well, but it's really important to realize that any interventions that economics, or most interventions that economics argues for or suggests are political interventions. So for economics to impact on the world, it normally has to impact the world through politics. For economics to do experiments in the world, it does it normally through some sort of political mechanism. That's not just state-level politics or international politics. It could be small, localized politics, or it could be internal politics, internal to an organization or a company. But there's still political aspects always to any interventions economics makes. So there's, in these ways and many more, economics clearly deals with very political topics. Secondly, economics quite clearly affects politics. Again, there's loads of examples of this. I'm not going to spend hours going through them. But just 3 different ways of thinking about it is trained economists go and work in the government and have significant roles in lots of places. This is just economists who do undergrad degrees. So via education, economists train undergrads who study economics. They train master students who study economics. These people go and work in government. And this is disproportionately more economists go and work in government than any other social science. You have a government economics service in the UK. You do not have a government sociological service. You do not have a government anthropological service. You know, it's quite significant. So people that are trained in economics and educated in economics have significant roles throughout political discourse, and not just in the state as well, in organizations, etc. Secondly, economists themselves, they don't just train future policymakers, they interact with politics, they advise politics. This is Milton Friedman and George Bush. I chose 2 people that I'm sure everyone here loves the most. But yeah, it's quite obvious and quite clear, especially in America, that academic economists have more impact on policy production than significant other academic disciplines, especially in the social sciences. And lastly, economists have jobs elsewhere. I've again chosen a polemical image from the film Inside Job, which highlights some of the other roles economists play within American finance and American society, and it suggests that there might be conflicts of interest. You don't even need the suggestion of conflict of interest. I'm not going to go into that debate, just to say they have clearly significant political roles just by being in these significant political institutions and organizations. So, economics deals with very political topics. Economics affects politics, which gives us a clear first relation that economics has a relation to politics in one direction. But that's the kind of simple question to some degree, and it's a question that most economists would happily admit. The more interesting questions are whether that has an impact on the output of economics itself. It's something about the output of economics, is it politicized? That's a much more difficult question to answer. I'm not going to answer it one way or the other, but I'm now going to think about 2 other aspects, which might at least undermine the idea that it's not. So the next thing I want to talk about is the ways politics has affected economics. I've done effects rather than affects. There's going to be a million spelling errors and a million grammatical errors in this. I apologize in advance. I'm terrible at that and lazy. So let's think about some of the ways in which politics has affected economics. There's a lot of ways you can think about this schematically. You can think about the fact that being an economic advisor gives prestige, which is more likely to get you higher up in the economics discipline. So therefore, a link to politics helps you with your as an academic economist. I'm not really going to think about the kind of generic institutional frameworks. I just want to talk about 2 episodes. There's 2 brief historical episodes in the history of economics that just might make you see some of the ways in which politics has affected economics. The first is the research assessment exercise and the history of the research assessment exercise. The research assessment exercise, nicknamed the RAE, if you don't know it, it's now been called the Research Excellence Framework. It's the exercise framework, I'm not sure what it is, which is institutionalized. It's meant to assess academic research and output in the UK. This happens for all departments, and there's a committee for each different kind of discipline, and each committee will then assess that discipline in different universities around the country. The idea is to try and make sure that research is excellent. So the history of that, though, is interesting. It was set up by the Thatcher government in 1986. The idea was to try and expose universities to market forces. It had lots of criticisms, lots of support. It was criticized from the right for exposing universities not to market forces but to state forces. And lots of people of our own government and libertarian aspects of the Thatcher government didn't like it for that reason. But there's lots of other criticisms and history involved in it. I'm again not going to get into whether it's concretely bad for all of university. It's just interesting to think about what impact it's had on one discipline, economics in particular. And Fred Lee has argued quite powerfully with quite a lot of data, I can send that to anyone who wants to see it, that the research assessment exercise has had kind of outsized influence on heterodox economics and helped homogenize UK economics. So it's had a disproportionately negative impact on the ability to do heterodox economics, and that has had an impact, helped homogenize UK economics. Okay, I'm using terms heterodox, I'm going to say neoclassical, mainstream, non-mainstream. I'm using them really loosely, partly because I haven't got time to do a whole taxonomy and discuss them, and I know they're really controversial, but I'm sure you kind of have a brief understanding of what I mean loosely. So admittedly, Fred Lee himself is a heterodox economist, and he was here for a point. He was a post-Keynesian, so you should take what he says with a pinch of salt. But he has a really lot of good data which highlights some of the ways in which this has happened and some of the trends since 1986. He gives a lot of data and lots of different mechanisms. Here, I can send anyone who wants to see it, his book and some of his papers. There's loads of discussion of this. Not all of it is necessarily, well, you can criticize parts of it, but in general, the story is quite compelling. Basically, one example of one of the mechanisms he gives, this is just one of the mechanisms, there's lots of other mechanisms he argues for, but one of the examples of one of the mechanisms he gives is he suggests that the research assessment exercise was captured by the mainstream early on. So what he means by this is that, if you think about it schematically, when you set up an assessment process, you're going to choose from the leading members of the field to then assess the rest. This, in most disciplines, there was an attempt to think of leading members of the field, but think about them in terms of strata. So if you have a survey, you stratify the survey, you try and take bits from each strata. In economics, what happened is that everyone from the committee was taken and was supported by the Royal Economic Society. The Royal Economic Society is the dominant society of economics in the UK, but it's also really dominated and basically just one aspect of economic thought. It's dominated by neoclassical mainstream economics, or at least it was then. So he argues that essentially what happened is that the assessment exercise for economics was set up in the image of the dominant ideas of the time, based on the Royal Economic Society and based on neoclassical economics. This led to a bunch of a skewed methodology, more skewed than other research assessment exercises, such that there was a list called the diamond list. And the diamond list is the kind of list of like, I've forgotten the number now, I think it's changed a couple of times, but a list of the top journals in economics. They're all neoclassical. And if you publish in those journals, there's lots of data to suggest that your research assessment exercise score is much higher. Essentially, what this meant is that it was quite clear to everyone that if you publish in these big journals, you publish in the right way with the right kind of methodology and the right ideas in these journals, you're going to do better on the research assessment exercise, which means your department is going to do better, which means your department is going to get more money. This clearly changed hiring patterns and internal policies in departments. So departments across the country who might have had more heterodox economists hired more mainstream neoclassical economists. Lee's got lots of data on this. The hiring since '86 really went at one direction. And internally, economists were pressured, pressure might be the wrong word. It was clear that it had an internal self-impact where people decided to publish in these journals, maybe do work that would work in these journals more so. Just simply because it gives you a higher research ranking and then more money for your department. This is a quote from Lee at the end. This is what he thinks the conclusion of it was. He thinks the near complete dominance of mainstream economics in British universities has emerged not because it is right, but because it has access to state and organisational power. So what he means is that by state and organisational power, he means this through the Royal Economic Society and through the setting up of the research assessment exercise, neoclassical economics was able to entrench its domination, which it already was dominant at the time, but it's become more so. I mean, you can see how this would be the case. You can think about functional evolutionary arguments in general. If you set up something that institutionalizes a power structure at a certain time, whoever is in the most power at that time is going to strengthen themselves. But his argument is this happened more in economics than anywhere else because of this connection to the Royal Economic Society. There's a lot to be said here. I I think he gets, in broad strokes, quite a lot of it right. There's a lot of controversial stuff too. But even so, it's just interesting to think about the different ways in which politics has had a relationship to economics. Even if his complete story is slightly biased given who he is, I think it's interesting to realize that there really has been a clear impact, and they're always from politics to economics. And that's just one example of it. A second example, shifting from the UK to the USA, and shifting time period a little bit earlier, is an example of a group of economists that call themselves radical in the late 60s, early 70s. So in the US, in the late 60s and early 70s, and in fact, all over the world, there was a lot of campus unrest, a lot of protests all over campuses. This is related to the Vietnam War, but also related to issues of poverty, related to issues of imperialism, lots of things. The same in France as well, same in the UK to a lesser degree. This is one flyer from this period from 1967, in which Harvard students had a big protest on campus, much like Occupy stuff now, against what they saw as urban imperialism in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard was buying up land of poorer residents of Massachusetts, and they saw it as a form of social cleansing around the Harvard campus. In this period of kind of unrest, there are a number of economists who thought that economics was not answering interesting questions that were relevant to lots of things like this. They didn't think that that economics was doing enough to address the economics of imperialism, the economics of race, the economics of poverty, the economics of gender. And in doing so, they created quite a large network. It was mainly junior faculty, so this is tenure track, so quite significant, and then also graduate students, economists, a large network of these economists called radical economists all over the country. And they're at really significant places. There's places like Harvard, Yale, MIT, Michigan. It started in Michigan, but also others. And this was if we consider now, we think about rethinking economics and CSEP and stuff, there's lots of stuff going on with related to similar questions. But that's mainly by graduate students and one or two academics, and those one or two academics tend not to be the best institutions, unfortunately. People like Harjun Chang here and some of the people in development studies are in the minority, whereas this is at the time, this is significant junior, high faculty at Harvard, Yale, MIT, Michigan. This is not happening in the States now. This is much more significant access to discourse on economic issues from this group. This group was really successful. They had massive student numbers. They had huge classes of 750 people. Their work was published in the biggest journals, not marginalized, the tiny little journals like nowadays. They were all at the AEA conference. They played a role in mainstream economic discourse. And they really grew quite a lot. There's a lot of reviews of their work in the big journals, at the big conferences, suggesting this was a way forward, that this kind of economics was going to grow and grow and grow. And yet, under the pressure of student protests in the late 60s, their positions were fine. But as the student protests abated slightly in the early 70s, most of these economists, in fact almost all, had their tenure applications denied and had their contracts failed to be reviewed. When it first started, it was quite clear. It was an easy story to say that, okay, maybe they just weren't good enough, but it was a quite clear pattern and developed in which pretty much everyone who called themselves a radical economist failed to get a job or failed to get tenure. This is Sam Bowles up here. The story of Sam Bowles is one of the most striking and one of the ones that was the most controversial and caused a massive investigation. Because Sam Bowles is now a significant economist whose name you might have heard of, who went to set up a similar kind of radical cadre of economists at the UMass Amherst, and that's how that started. Sam Bowles is now quite significant and quite successful. When he went up for tenure in, I think it's either late 1972 or early 1973. I can't find out when the exact meetings and stuff were. He was nominated by these three people, among others. This is at Harvard, by the way. It's a big university. He was nominated by J.K. Galbraith, Vasily Leontief, and Ken Arrow. This is 6 months after Ken Arrow wins the Nobel Prize. This is just under a year before Vasily Leontief wins the Nobel Prize. And this is J.K. Galbraith, right? He's nominated by some of the biggest people in the department and fails to get tenure. That's quite significant. If you think about that nowadays, you think about the idea now that you would be nominated by a just Nobel Prize winner, next year's Nobel Prize winner, and one of the biggest shots in your department, and not get tenure. That was kind of ridiculous, right? that this caused controversy, right? People started being like, okay, this is ridiculous now. All these guys, no one's getting tenure, no one's getting contract reviews, and it's caused a bit of a stir amongst students and amongst the media. And it caused the American Economic Association to investigate. The American Economic Association had a large meeting. They realized they had to set up a committee to investigate these tenure hire practices and decided to have a look at them. They concluded, however, that there was no in almost all cases, they concluded there was no definite evidence of discrimination. They looked into it in detail and said, no, we can't see any evidence of discrimination. However, some of the quotes that come up in each of their reviews of different people's cases are really quite telling about the power the committee had in the first place. So this is one quote. I've forgotten whose review this was they looked into, but it's really interesting. So they say that the investigation committee's original mandate will rarely, if ever, be feasible to execute. It must be candidly said, I think this is Ken Arrow writing, by the way, it must be candidly said that if political factors did enter, say, in evaluation of research or of teaching, it would require only the slightest skill on the part of administrators or departments to conceal that fact. Indeed, it might require no skill at all because the factors may well have been operating at an unconscious level. What Arrow is saying is that the committee you set up and what we're meant to do is impossible. You can't find a clear smoking gun of political discrimination in hiring and firing practices because it's just it doesn't. Because first of all, if you knew that was going to be investigated later, it's quite easy to hide it. And second of all, this is more important. It's quite possible that this happens at an unconscious level. People just say, no, it's not worthwhile work. I don't see this because they have their pre-ingrained prejudices. So he's saying that either it's too easy to hide it or there's prejudice involved. So actually, even though we find no definite evidence of discrimination, these reports are redundant anyway. Even given that, and even given how easy it would be to hide it, and even given that it might go at an unconscious level, and even given that this committee was way understaffed and sometimes took 2-4 years to investigate cases backwards, even then, later on, they found a number of cases in which they did think discrimination came up. And in one case, Peter Boehmer at UC San Diego, this is later on, after they've said later that lots of cases they don't see definite discrimination, then of Peter Boehmer later, they conclude that there was political discrimination, this is at UC San Diego, and not only that, but the FBI were involved and funded his harassment, and further, had funded the harassment of other radicals, which they'd previously said had not been harassed. So it's quite clear that it's like, that there was something going on. There's a sense in which politics, and not just politics, but the FBI and the state apparatus of politics, had an impact on what was happening in economics, and this had an impact on the economics that we see, and especially the American economics we see today. And this is, I have to say, this is not just economics. This is quite profound in economics and quite significant. But McCarthy, sorry, Edith's telling me to slow down. I apologize. But McCarthyism and the general attitude of post-McCarthyism and numerous other things had quite a profound impact on American academia, and has done, and still the impacts of that are still felt today. There's another great book arguing about the history of analytic philosophy that a similar thing happened. The positivists who moved from Austria in the 1940s had a lot of social democratic ideals, and essentially under the pressure of McCarthyism, they decided to just do logic. So there's lots of interesting things about this, but the history of positivism can also be thinking about this, history of philosophy. But in economics, what resulted in was a climate of marginalization and a climate of fear. What this meant is that significant economists like Samuel Bowles, who might have then gone on to have significant careers in economic discourse at Harvard or at MIT, at Michigan or Yale, then didn't. They were marginalized to the fringes. Samuel Bowles was one of the lucky cases. He managed to negotiate for him and 4 other people, including Gintis and numerous others, to go and get job, I think it was 4, actually the number is wrong, it might not be 4, but a few others to go and get a job together at UMass Amherst and set up this collective of radical economists, and that's how it started. But most others went to other universities that were even less heard of, or out of economics entirely. And even then, the fact that they're at UMass Amherst makes a huge difference. I mean, if you think about New York Times journalists taking a quote on economics nowadays, they tend not to ask someone who's a professor at UMass Amherst. They tend to ask someone who's a professor at Harvard or at Yale or MIT. And if these guys were there, it would have made a huge difference, right? So marginalization. But the second point, and this is almost even more significant, is the climate of fear. What this means is that if you align yourself as a radical economist or think that the economics, and then consequently because of the because of what they argued for, think that it's worthwhile looking at the economics of race or imperialism or gender or poverty, you realize you're not going to get tenure, so you don't do that. right? So these set of episodes creates a climate of marginalization, a climate of fear, which impacts the nature of economics in America for the next period afterwards. So this is just 2 episodes, but it helps to cash out the ways in which politics can have an effect on economics. So we've seen economics can have an effect on politics, but politics can also have an effect on economics. Now, there's there's multiple other aspects in the relationship between economics and politics. There's one other thing I want to explore as well. We've seen economics affecting politics. We've seen politics affecting economics. We've seen there's a kind of bi-directional relationship there. But it's also worth thinking about the internal politics of any institutional form. Any institution and institutional form has relations, and it's worth thinking about the internal politics of them because it makes you realize what kind of things, if you are an actor in that space, you have to deal with. So there's lots and lots of examples of this. Actually, not as many as there could be. Like, not that many people are writing on it, but Marion Fourcade, a sociologist who I spoke about in a lecture I did last year, has written a paper last year about this, which is really controversial and really interesting. It was in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, so it has had a massive impact on a lot of economists have read this too. It's a big economics journal. But in it she's argued that economics exhibits a really pronounced hierarchy, and one that's more significant in economics than it is in other academic disciplines. So you'd expect most academic disciplines to have some sort of hierarchy, but her argument and her co-author's argument is that it's particularly pronounced in economics. She argues other things too, but I'm just going to discuss this one aspect. She thinks the pronounced hierarchy comes out in a number of forms. First of all, there is a much stronger correlation between prestige and kinship in economics than there is in other disciplines. A correlation between prestige and kinship, what I mean by this is that if you're hiring, you're Harvard and you're hiring an economist, in economics, and most academics, but in economics more than anything else, you're likely to hire someone at Harvard's level or above. So this is the correlation between prestige and kinship is essentially there. If you get a job as an economist, essentially you're going to get a job at a rank department below where you did your PhD. And not only that, but the correlation is throughout your career. You're unlikely to climb up again. So there's a much stronger correlation here in economics than there is in other departments. It doesn't matter so much about your work, it matters just where you went. And this goes back to your master's and your undergrad too, because it's hard to get into Harvard unless you went, etc. So there's a long-term correlation between prestige and kinship in economics, which is more significant there than it is in sociology or anthropology. Secondly, and I think more stunningly, publications in big journals are, so given this, you're probably not going to get a PhD at Harvard or a job at Harvard unless you go to somewhere similar beforehand. The fact that publications in big journals in economics are highly concentrated is quite important, because what I'm essentially saying here is, what this means is that if you, I think it's almost 50% of people who publish in the Quarterly Journal of Economics are at the top 5 departments in the United States. 57.8% of publications in the Quarterly Journal of Economics are authored by PhDs from the top 5 departments. So it's even more there. I mean, that's quite stunning. It means if you want to publish in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, you have a much better chance of doing that if you do a PhD from Harvard or MIT or Chicago, whatever, than you do if you go anywhere else. And that's compared to a big journal in sociology, which is comparable to the ones with the strongest relationship there, where only 35.4% in sociology. I mean, that's also really high and quite stunning and shows hierarchy in academia generally, but it just shows how much more hierarchical economics is, how much more important it is that you get your PhD from a big place or you teach at a big place. This has stopped working, I think. I'll use the keyboard then. Yeah, okay. Oops. Yeah, okay. Furthermore, more than any other disciplines, not only do the journals favor authors from the big departments, they favor authors from their own in-house departments. So the Quarterly Journal of Economics is published at Harvard, and a really disproportionately high number of people are either from Harvard or MIT. The Journal of Political Economy is published in Chicago. A really high portion of people are authors from Chicago. Now you can see how that might happen in any academic discipline. That the editors are from there, your supervisors there, etc. What's significant is that it's higher in economics than it is elsewhere. So all this is saying is that there are automatic hierarchical relationships in academia that seem to make some sense, but it's noticeable that it's stronger in economics, which highlights a higher trend towards hierarchy in economics. And the last point is the American Economic Association, which is the professional body for economists in America, and it also has a significant role in the rest of the world, is also much more highly concentrated than other professional bodies for other departments. So if you look at this, have a look at this graph, I'll explain a little bit what it means. So this graph's the membership of the AEA Council, so the council who govern the AEA, and it compares membership of the AEA Council based on where they're from to membership of the APSA, which is the American Political Science Association, and the ASA, which is the American Sociology Association. So this bit here on the left is saying that 72% of the AEA Council are from the top 5 departments in economics, compared to the American Political Science, where it's 12%, or American Sociology Association, where it's 20%. That's really quite stunning, right? That's a really stunning hierarchy, and it just shows, again, there's a really, really strict hierarchy in economics, and it's hard to break it. And because of that, it's going to be hard to then, I mean, if you have to deal with this hierarchy all the time, it means you want to try to take a photo of that, Jostein. I can also send it to you, but it just shows that if you want to be an economist and publish economics and be a successful economist, you have to deal with this hierarchy. You have to know about it, which means you need to probably get a job. You probably do a PhD at one of the big places and probably get a job at one of the big places. And to do that, from the last slide, you obviously can't do economics of poverty or economics of race because you're going to not get tenure. So it's just, it all shows that there's a kind of, there's a lot of different ways in which politics impacts what comes out of economics. And so there's a third relationship in my relation schema that economics itself has its own politics, and the politics that you must deal with if you want to be a professional economist. There's lots of things that I've said, and there's lots of ways in which these relationships that I've discussed overlap. But just to kind of start, what I'm just suggesting is this question is very hard to answer. Does economics have politics? But to start thinking about it, it's worth at least starting thinking about a number of different relationships. It's worth thinking about the ways that economics affects politics, which is what I discussed first, the ways in which there's political questions, in which it has significant roles in politics, but also the ways in which politics affects economics. This can be schematically in terms of the what kind of prestige you get from being related to politics, but also there's a lot of historical episodes that show that politics has direct and intervenes directly on the history of economics to make sure that it has a form that it wants. And thirdly, economics has its own internal political relationships. This brings up obviously lots of questions. It doesn't conclude that economics is political. It doesn't say that the output is definitely politicized, but it does at least undermine the idea that it might not be. It does at least, so economists often talk about the positive and normative distinction, and there's lots of debate around that. I could do a whole other lecture on that. But even so, if you consider these factors, you start to realize that even the questions that are going to be asked, or even the fact that people argue for such a distinction, clearly has a relationship to the sociological history of this institution. There's a number of questions that arise from this. I don't know how much, I probably don't have enough time to go through, but I might have time to go through one of them. The first is one that I haven't addressed. And another way you could go at it completely, which is the way that Ha-Joon Chang talks about, is that whether economics is inherently political itself. So I've talked about the discipline of economics and whether economics as a discipline has political relationships. But you could also think about the subject matter of economics and think about whether there's something about that that's inherently political. Ha-Joon argues that, that because power relations affect the economy, you have to think about power relationships, so that in some sense economics is inherently political. He also thinks that more than any other discipline, it's quite obvious that value judgments play a role in what you want to think about economically. And so again, economics should be thought of as inherently political. Furthermore, he argues that the market itself is a political construct. If you have to construct the thing that you're investigating by political means, you're investigating politics. At least that's what Ha-Joon thinks. And there's other questions about the positive and normative economic distinction. I haven't really said very much about it, but all I want to say is that what I have said, I think, at least informs the way you might want to answer this question a bit more. In particular, this value judgment one, because not only is it in economics, but there's a lot of discussion in science in general, whether you can really evaluate theories and evidence completely with a perfectly objective criteria. I think that there's interesting debates there. Haven't made out my mind on that. But it's definitely the case that if you think about the history of economics, that you might make certain decisions and not others, given thinking about your career in some circumstances. But the question I think is most interesting, and the reason why most economists or people in general, scientists in general, might avoid the idea that their discipline is politicized, is that it makes questions for what we think about the objectivity of economics. This is important not just for mainstream economists, but for anyone who considers themselves a non-mainstream economist too, because if you say economics is inherently political, or it's politicized and you accept that, then if you then want to say, well, I can offer impartial advice, that seems a bit contradictory, right? You can't say, mainstream economics is really politicized and it's inherently political, but I can offer impartial advice. There's a question of objectivity here that's important. Economics in particular, economists really want to play an advisory role, and so they want to think about the objectivity question. So I think I might have a little bit of time, just 5 minutes. Okay, cool. So I'm going to briefly say a little bit about what I think, how this might have a relationship in that. So this is a massive topic, even bigger than the whole topic I'm talking about in general. But I just want to say how it relates to what I've been saying, and so just to start thinking about it, because I think this is the important factor in all of it. I think the reason why people want to talk about whether economics is positive, normative, political, etc., is they want to be able to give advice, and they want to be able to claim objectivity, right? So it's worth thinking about what people mean about objectivity, because I don't think people are very clear on it. I think people assume that objectivity is just one thing and it's obvious, but actually there's multiple ways in which you can think about it. There's at least two. The first way of thinking about objectivity is the one most people think about. Most people think about objectivity like objects, external from me. So this thing is objectively exists, it's external. I can have a view, the idea of a kind of view from nowhere, truth external from people, kind of God's eye view, right? That's the first way people think about objectivity. But the second way people think about objectivity is kind of different. They think about it as a process. They think about my method is objective, right? These are crucially different things, right? There's a crucial distinction between saying a view from nowhere and saying my method in some sense is not just about me, it's about generalized things. It's not just a reflection of myself. So it's important to think about these differences when you're asking questions about objectivity. In general, the first one, while it might be an important ideal, it's debatable, but while it might be an important ideal, it seems difficult to be attained. There may be viewpoints from nowhere, but we're never really going to know a viewpoint from nowhere. So really, when we talk about objectivity, we really mean something like that second. We really mean a process, some sort of way in which you create something close to a view from nowhere based on the fact that the knowledge practices you employ somehow aren't just specialized, specific to yourself. So there's lots of questions about. But what I've said throughout this talk raises a lot of questions about the economics record on this, about the record of economics on being able to create a process which is external from the specific economists acting at each time. But it's also lots of questions about whether this is possible in general. Is it ever possible to have a practice which really gets away from the specific nature of each individual exploration and each individual practitioner? In particular, is it ever possible for economics? If economics has a kind of inherent basis. There's another question that I can't really get into. But there's the main point here is that there's lots of history debate about this kind of stuff, about process of objectivity, a view from nowhere, objectivity in general, whether it's available for any science, whether it's available for economics. There's loads of different debates about this. But I don't think there's any overall answer. But one thing that I think is worth thinking about, as well as thinking about the fact there's at least two ways of thinking about objectivity, is that really, maybe it makes more sense to not think about objectivity as one thing, as perfect, pure knowledge, but think about it as partial. If you think about objectivity as a process, then you realize that there's lots of different aspects to any process to kind of nullify your subjectivity. I'm not sure if that makes sense. I'll try and put that in another phrase. If you act as a scientist or an academic or as an economist, there's lots of different aspects and ways in which you can make what you're doing generalizable. So you could try and take a photo rather than doing an observation, or you could try and use, just literally by being trained as an expert for long periods of time, your eyesight might be better towards certain generalization than others. There's a long history about the many different ways that you can try and avoid one's subjectivity. But the point is that those many different ways often lead to different methodologies that aren't necessarily compatible. So economics has taken the route of thinking if we use quantification and mathematics and mathematical frameworks, and we think about so it's very Platonic, and think about the idea of the forms and rational structures, then we somehow get away from the nitty-gritty of our subjectivity at the moment. But that's not the only way. There's lots of other ways in which you can think about avoiding your subjectivity. Like I said, you can think about just snapshot statistics and not thinking about rational structures. Econometrics, a long history of trying to do this too. There's lots of different ways of avoiding subjectivity. There's not one process, not one way of getting to a view from nowhere, but lots of different ways of getting to subjectivity. And those different ways essentially are different methodologies and are different ways of getting to generalizations. And different methodologies lead to different ontological frameworks and different schools of thought, essentially. So what I'm saying is that there's no standard appraisal about what is objective and what is not. it's always going to be context dependent, partially. So the best way to be objective in a certain scenario is going to depend on what your goals of that scenario, and it's going to be context dependent. So it's going to be context dependent there, which means that you're going to do different things in that place and you might do in another place, which means you need to apply different methodologies in that place on that question than you do elsewhere. And so what I'm arguing is essentially arguing for the whole of CSEP in the first place, is that the only way to really think about objectivity properly and to think about avoiding the fact, well, not avoiding, but getting to terms with the fact that economics is politicized, has a political history, is by thinking about objectivity as a context-dependent thing. Starting to realize that in each different context, it's going to be different. There's going to be important reasons why you might want to choose one practice over another, and they're going to relate to objectivity and relate to your subjectivity, but they're not really going to be generalizable to all positions. So that's a little aside at the end that I'm arguing separately. But generally, the point is that the question, is economics political, is massive. You can't really answer it in 40 minutes. But there's lots of different ways you should think about it. You should think about it in terms of the way economics affects politics, the way politics affects economics, or the internal politics it has. And also, furthermore, you shouldn't necessarily assume that just because it's difficult for, just because you want to have some sort of objectivity, that you can say that economics has to be non-political. You can have the two things as long as you think about objectivity in a slightly more partial manner and start to realize that it's going to be context dependent. But that's it. If you want some more reading, these are good texts. This is the one on internal politics. This is the ones on radical economists, and this is on the RAE. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So we have a couple of minutes for questions, if you have any.
Yeah. Either one of you.
Maybe just in respondents. I think the case that you described with economists choosing neutral topics, safe topics, was what happened to Yanis Varoufakis, because he specialized in game theory, which is very sexy for mainstream. Although he is, as he describes himself, as a Marxist, but I believe he wasn't doing that earlier when he was nurturing his academic career. That's interesting to think about.
Yeah, there's lots. You're right, and there's lots of episodes. Thomas Piketty has also said the methodology he employed in his book is partly related to the fact that he knows that's the only way he's going to be listened to, rather than doing other things. So it's, yeah, I mean, he hasn't in his book. He doesn't talk about bargaining power at all, for example. But I think he thinks it's important. He just avoids it because he knows it won't get published otherwise.
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, so I wonder if you can talk about how big business and Wall Street, for example, may affect what happens in academia. So I know in science, when I was in undergrad, my professor had his own dreams, but he decided to change courses because that had more research funding from, including, coming from private firms, because that was what was cool, and you could make products for it. So I'm wondering what happens with big corporations, because people now are leaving academia, going to working in consultancies, going to the government. So I'm wondering if big business can influence how academics work.
Yeah, it's very hard for me to say yes. I mean, it seems obvious that there is relationships. You'd have to look at it in detail. It's not. There's always, I suppose, one thing to say is that it's definitely the case that big businesses have impact on discourse in general, in academia and outside of academia, largely just because they have power and discourse power. Well, that makes no sense. But they have a large space, and they occupy a large space in our discourse on these issues, and therefore plays roles in that. And you're right, they also use money to impact what academics say. But it's also worth to think about, this is not the only thing. It's not the first time this happened. This has happened throughout history. Lots of academics and philosophers and economists of the past were patrons of rich people, right? I mean, academia is set up as that. Academia is kind of like a weird social contract where you say, okay, I'll teach rich kids as long as you let me do some thinking on the side. It's kind of like what it has been the whole time. So I don't necessarily think that's any different. I just think that you need to think about and realize that it's always been politicized and social in some way, and that needs to play a part in your thought. You just need to not ignore that factor.
I was wondering if you looked also at the international dimension of the internal politics and economics, because I do feel like it's a field that's very dominated by Anglo-Saxon institutions. So I don't know if that's fitting within your research or if it's an issue.
Yeah, I mean, actually, most of this is not massively close to my research. It's related to it, but it is. But Manuel Foucault has got a really great book on comparing France, Britain, America, economics and societies. But within that, she has a big section also discussing the impact. The reason why she's chosen those institutions, and especially the Anglophone world, is that it has a really important impact on the rest of academic economics. So I haven't looked at that in detail, but it's definitely true that it's there. In particular, it's noticeable that lots of mainland Europe were starting to publish more and more in English, and particularly in Germany, and therefore picking up the mantles and ideas of other economics. So yes, it's a massive factor. Loads more can be said on it. It could have a whole other ring on my ring of circles. Yeah?
Yeah, so I was wondering about your point about pluralism, and it's not, I'm not trying to refute or anything, but I just wanted to raise a point because, I'm from the faculty of history, so sorry for intruding, but in history, I think the dominant trend right now is that there's sort of a shying away from like the narrative ever since, post-Marxism in academia, because, ever since the Marxism, there hasn't been a very powerful, narrative in any kind of, historical period in general. And I'm talking in a kind of Anglo-American sense. And my point is that pluralism is very good, but sometimes I wonder because, you read certain, recent works of history and they cover lots of topics, and yet because of this, desire to be objective, this desire to say, okay, I want to recognize all factors and give them equal weight, it's kind of, you do sort of end up being plural, but then you also, in a way, you don't really take a stand, if that makes sense. And obviously, I'm not saying that, that then that means we should all just be like dogmatic and say, well, right, this is what I believe, I'm from this school of thought. But at the same time, it's also kind of that, there's a balance where you do also have to make sure that your, opinions come clear. And I'm not sure how to sort of,
no,
capitalize on that.
I totally agree with you, completely. In fact, more than maybe it seems. There's been a lot of arguments for pluralism. The Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism has got the word pluralism in it. I would argue that most of them are quite unclear and seem to be all over the place. It's not really clear exactly what you mean. I want to be clear. What I'm saying is specific. Is that we should recognize that objectivity is context dependent, and because we recognize that, we should encourage different possible methodologies to exist in a discipline, but not each person to have to do everything. There can be lots of partial perspectives. It's important to have partial perspectives, and one economist could be very partial in one way, another can be another way, and doing different methodologies might be seen as objective in different positions and be useful in different places under different contexts. I'm not saying that everyone should just kind of like just do everything. I just think that there should be a more balanced recognition that objectivity and pragmatism dictates that there should be different methodologies in different places.
So yeah, thanks. It's a good question.
Okay, thank you, Jack. For those of you who are interested, tomorrow is the CSEP lecture at 3 p.m. in Mill Lane, room 9, and it's on Africa and why economists get it wrong. And next week in paper 0, we'll be hearing from Jose Almada, who will give an introduction to Schumpeter's perspective and in particular on capitalism as creative destruction. So I hope to see you next week. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.